Good evening, everyone. This is Stephanie Rizas. I am a teacher in Bethesda, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C. I teach an IB history course, which is a 2-year-long course about Asia, and I also teach psychology and East Asian studies. So I am happy to be here tonight to talk to you a little bit about how I use an article from Education About Asia in really 2 out of 3 of the classes that I mentioned, maybe not so much psychology, but certainly in the History of Asia IB course and my East Asian Studies elective. And hopefully I will also have time to talk about how I modify it for other classes as well. So the article that I'm going to be talking about tonight is the Education About Asia article, Why Did Japan Succeed and China Fail, and Isn't Modernization the Same Thing as Westernization? This was in the 2003 winter issue of Education About Asia, and I've been using it ever since. Basically, I use it in my IB classes to help students prepare and conduct a Socratic seminar. And in my other classes, I have an excerpt of it that I use just to kind of get the main points across. In this particular set of slides, I'm going to be talking about the Socratic seminar and how I use this article as a jumping off point to understanding the difference between modernization and westernization, to understand the rise of the Meiji Restoration period and the fall of the Qing dynasty. So I'm sure many of you have done Socratic seminars before. I just kind of introduced this to my students, talking about how they're going to be conducting this discussion on their own. They kind of have gone through the content of the Meiji Restoration and the self-strengthening movement with me through in-class activities and lectures, and now this is their opportunity to show me what they know and apply it to some more critical thinking. All right, so they are required to read not just the portion of the article that I use, but also these primary sources. So some of them will read the Japan sources, some of them will read the Chinese sources, and those will kind of give them additional evidence one way or the other regarding the success and failure idea. And so they go through all of these in advance of the actual seminar. Plus they read the excerpt of the article that I will share in a moment as well. We kind of review just the main ideas together before beginning the Socratic seminar, just talking about the differing responses to imperialism that we see in Meiji Japan and the self-strengthening movement under Empress Cixi. I try to make sure to highlight some of the successes of the self-strengthening movement, because those often get kind of forgotten. It's much easier to just make it binary: Meiji success, China failure, but that's not really accurate, right? The self-strengthening movement wasn't as successful as perhaps it was intended by some reformers, but there were some improvements like military and education and attempts to reform the government, even if they did fail. So I try to make sure I highlight that and go through some of the main ideas behind the changes during the Meiji and self-strengthening movements. And then we also talk about sort of the crux of the article, which is this idea of westernization versus modernization. Like, what do those two terms mean? Why are they different? Why are they useful or not useful in talking about history? So we spend a lot of time discussing. Well, I tell them to think about that question, and they spend a lot of time discussing that in the Socratic seminar. So this is the seminar topic. What is the difference between modernizing and westernizing, and why might the Meiji Restoration be seen as more successful than the self-strengthening movement in modernizing? So the first question is kind of to eliminate this idea of that westernizing is an appropriate term to use when talking about these two places. And the second question is to get them to think about, well, how do we define success, and why might some people might be able to argue the self-strengthening movement had moments of modernization, and try to think about it a bit more critically than in that binary approach that is so often the case. All right, these are just some general group instructions for how they come up with their groupings, and then how they come up with their questions that they're going to raise in the Socratic seminar. I'll show you all of this on our Socratic seminar prep sheet in a moment. This is what I asked them to think about as they're preparing for the seminar. And this again helps them sort of tap into the article from Education About Asia, this idea that maybe trying to categorize something as westernized or modernized shouldn't be used as interchangeable terms, but in fact are two very different concepts. So I asked them to think about that as they prepare. And then the day of the Socratic seminar, at the end, I kind of use this quote to summarize what they've just discussed. So when they're finished with the Socratic seminar, I ask them to write one final reflection, and I use this quote from the Education About Asia article, which says, "If we view the acceptance or rejection of the West as the key factor behind East Asia's modern historical path, we reinforce certain stereotypes of a static East and a dynamic West." And I asked them to think about what does that mean and how might it maybe change their views from the seminar, how does it confirm their views from the seminar, basically just trying to think about how the word westernization versus modernization plays into this quote here, and this idea of a stereotype of a static East and a dynamic West. This is the Socratic seminar preparation sheet that I was mentioning. So this is where they spend at least 2 or 3 days in class preparing for the seminar, so this is where they can keep all of their notes. It is a lot of work, and I mean, it's kind of like a spoken DBQ almost, because they have to use text to justify so much of their point in the discussion. So this is how I kind of break it down so that they have something tangible to use during the discussion. Here's where they compare the different responses to the West in Meiji and Qing China. That kind of helps them also see some bigger pictures about what westernization could mean versus economic reforms and things like that. This is where they put in some of their arguments and potential responses to other people's arguments. And then at the very end, they kind of look at some highlights from the conversation. All right. So that's basically the way I use this article. I think it's really helpful article in getting them to see 2 different things. I mean, I think for one thing, it's helpful for them to understand the difference between westernization and modernization. I think it's helpful to have them look at Meiji versus the self-strengthening movement in a very different way than our textbook provides. And I also think it's a good way for them to see like why studying history matters, because this not only touches on the history of Japan and China, but it also shows that when you use certain terminology, maybe different historical events that use, similarly binary terms might be more complex than that, and it helps them think about what is the work of a historian in sort of proving that something that is remembered one way might not be the only way we can interpret it or consider it. I hope this has been helpful, and I'm happy to answer any further questions. Thanks so much.